So this is my simple framework to look at the brain, to think about the lobes of the brain. It's just yin and yang, the front and the back. So anterior versus posterior is motor versus sensory. The front of the brain does motor stuff, movement. The back of the brain does sensory stuff, your senses, right? So it's really just two parts, right? But we talk about them as four lobes. The frontal lobe, in the front, obviously, it's anterior. The parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. So instead of looking at it as four lobes, I look at it as the two parts of yin and yang to just make it easier for myself to think about. It's motor versus sensory. The frontal lobe is motor. All the other three lobes are sensory. Occipital is all the way in the back. Eyes in the back of your head is my little catchphrase to remember that. The mnemonic, right? So just like they say moms have eyes in the back of their head, the occipital, the visual part, the visual lobe of the brain is in the back of the brain. Eyes in the back of your head. Temporal is on the side where your ears are, because the temporal lobe does hearing, right? So it's on the side of the brain, just like your ears are on the side of your head. So eyes in the back of your head, ears are on the side, visual and hearing. And then the parietal is just somatosensory, right? Because if you're sensory and you're not one of the special senses, then you just have to be the normal sense. So somatosensation versus special sensation. That's the official term, special sensation, which is referring to hearing and vision, versus somatosensation is just touch. So you got the two special ones and this one generic one. Okay, special and then the one generic one. The parietal is kind of like the main character of sensation, whereas these two guys, or these two side characters, are kind of specialists, and they're also kind of smaller lobes in the brain. So you have motor versus sensory. Motor versus sensory. So that's all it is. With your brain, with lobes of the brain, thinking of them in this simplified spatial format is helpful for me, where you just have the very front and the very back, and then you have the two guys that are kind of in the middle, right? Of course, all of these guys are in the back, but this guy's in the very back. So I can represent it this way to say, look, you have the very back and the very front, and then the two in the middle that are kind of like taking up this space. Just remember those four by position. Or I can represent it this way and say, hey, it's sensory versus motor. And what divides, this dividing line is the central sulcus. So that central sulcus, it's literally called that because it is the center division of your brain. It divides the front of the brain from the back of the brain. It divides the motor from the sensory, So the four lobes of the cortex is a pretty simple concept, but this relationship of anterior versus posterior, being motor versus sensory, is something you'll see pop up again and again as you go forward. Not only in the cortex, but also in the spinal cord and even in the thalamus, for instance. So as long as you make sure to look out for it and notice it, that relationship can make things easier to learn going forward.